Wow, it's been a bit since the last deck tech on this channel, but we're back on Eldraine again, and out of all the new commanders, one really caught my attention. Now, if you've watched my deck techs before, you should realize how much I love attacking commanders, especially with equipment. So you might see how Kellan, the Fae-Blooded, instantly appealed to me. Now, I don't normally like the boring Boros equipment value commanders that seem to come out every set or so. Those really just give you card draw and ramp for playing an equipment deck. They all build about the same and play the same. But I feel Kellan is a bit different, because he's actually a double strike creature stapled to open the armory. So he's not just a value piece for an equipment deck, he's a tutor. And because of this, he's also a prime choice for a hidden commander deck. Do you want to assemble Cauldra? Kellan. Do you want to have Umezawa's Jitte as a secret commander? Kellan. The only downside I see to him is that he doesn't have black in his color identity, so we can't use him for an Elbrus the Binding Blade deck. That would have been really sweet. But for today, using our normal $80 budget, we're going to build a kick-ass Sword of X and Y tribal deck with Open the Armory, Kellan as our commander. To kick us off, Kellan the Fae-Blooded is a 2/2 human fairy for 2 and a red with double strike, and other creatures get +1/+0 for each aura and equipment attached to Kellan. He then also has an adventure for 1 and a white, and you can search your library for an aura or equipment card, reveal it and put it into your hand, and shuffle. This means Kellan is going to play almost identically every game. Turn 1 land, turn 2 cast Birthright Boon and fetch an equipment, turn 3 cast Kellan, and turn 4 attack with Kellan, potentially with the equipment you tutored for. In particular, the double strike here is incredible, since it means we can run a bunch of equipment that triggers on combat damaging a player, since it'll trigger twice each time with Kellan. And unlike some other Voltron or equipment commanders, in the late game, Kellan will also buff up all our other creatures, so we could potentially swing wide as well. Everything about Kellan is really good design in my opinion, and he's not forced into equipment either. I had a look, but I couldn't really make the aura deck work quite as well as the equipment, but the option is there if you want something a bit more unique. If he's not a plague on the format over the next few months, well, I'm completely out of touch with what he's useful for. Onto the deck, and let's start with the biggest category, the equipment we're going to try and put on Kellan. For that, we have Basilisk Collar for lifelink, Beamtown Beatstick for treasures, Bloodforge Battle Axe for more equipment, Zephyr Boots and Trailblazers Boots for evasion, Blackblade Reforged for making Kellan huge, Mask of Memory and Rogue's Gloves for card draw, Swiftfoot Boots for protection, Haunted Cloak, Quite a Spike to help cut our opponent's life totals into quarters, Sunforger for Sunforger, and Hammer of Nazan for indestructible and free equipping. You'll note from this that most of the equipment triggers on attacking happens on combat damage. This is deliberate so we can get those double strike triggers from Kellan, which really amplifies the abilities of these equipment. That ability is really what puts him over the edge for me, as we don't have to run a double striking equipment like you normally need in this kind of deck. But wait, you say, there is some equipment missing from this list. And of course that's our swords. And to fit inside this budget, we have the Sword of Forge and Frontier, Sword of Hearth and Home, Sword of One and Future, and Sword of War and Peace. These are the only ones I could fit in a deck of this price, but other than War and Peace, I think they're all really good swords for Commander especially. Sword of Hearth and Home is perhaps the best Sword of X and Y in Commander, and it's going to be my first tutor choice most of the time. And on that topic, you can see that we have the equipment in this deck to give us choices. We have ramp equipment to help power out mana at the start of the game, we have draw equipment to refill our hand, and we have damage and evasion to end games. If I was to suggest a top 3 equipment to search for on your turn 2 with this deck, I'd probably suggest Sword of Hearth and Home if you have cards in hand that you want to cast, Mask of Memory if you're a bit flooded on land and you think someone will leave themselves open on turn 4, or Hammer of Nazan if you've already got good equipment in your hand already. And if Kellan dies, it's not actually a huge deal, since that means you'll be able to cast his adventure again as well, though that does add on command attacks. Please be aware of that. Anytime you cast him from the command zone, either for the adventure or just him directly, it will cost you command attacks. Though there's no tax when you cast him from exile after using the adventure. Moving on, every equipment deck needs some equipment support pieces, and we have plenty of those as well. Cole the Forge Master so we can get Kellan back to hand if he dies, Pure Steel Paladin for card draw and free equips, Shram for more card draw, Akiri, Fearless Voyager for more card draw and protection, Brass Squire to re-equip everything in the late game, Cloudsteel Kirin as a searchable equipment creature to stop game-winning plays, Denatar Capuchin for a cheaper equip and another solid body, Foundry Inspector to make our equipment cheaper, Wyleth for more card draw, Aster for finding equipment and reducing equipping, Bellinor Battlehammer for pumping up damage and free equipping, Danathar for graveyard recursion, Titania, Ship's Caretaker for getting equipment back to hand if it's destroyed, and lastly Sun Titan for more graveyard recursion. And yes, this is what Sun Titan is here for, since it can get back every one of our swords of X and Y. Outside these creatures, we also have the Fighters class, since it does a bunch of stuff for equipment, Wake the Past to bring all our artifacts back from the graveyard in a long game, and of course Open the Armory, since having a second copy of our commander is always good. Now, Kellan has a second ability that he can buff up our other creatures if he has a lot of equipment on him. This isn't the most helpful in this kind of deck, but I put a few pieces in to help with using that as a secondary win con. With Felidar Retreat, we can make cat tokens, Keeper of the Accord for soldiers, and a Mirror Angel for birds. These can all generate a bunch of tokens pretty quickly, so it could be useful in going wide in a longer game. Now, before we get to the staples, there are a few other cards worth mentioning. We have Lucky Clover to be able to tutor up 2 equipment with Kellan's Adventure. We have White Mane Lion to be able to bounce Kellan back to our hand if we need to protect him, or if we want to recast him. Boros Charm and Blacksmith Skill for protection, and Sunforger synergy. Seriously, if you haven't seen Instant Speed Sunforger shenanigans, you really need to educate yourself, it's very powerful. We then also have Ketis Emberclaw Familiar, so that hitting one player hurts everybody. Reconstruct History, because it's just a solid recursion card. Discerning Financier, because it's an interesting new card from the set. And lastly, Relentless Assault for extra combats. A great finisher if Kellan is primed and ready to go. And that covers most of the Kellan specific parts of the deck. It's very straightforward to build a Voltron deck like this, and you tend to be very focused. Let's move on to the ramp, draw, and removal staples I've included to support this. For ramp, we have Sol Ring, Beamtown Beatstick, Arcane Signet, Mindstone, Talisman of Conviction, Commander Sphere, Sword of Hearth and Home, Burnished Heart, Solemn Simulacrum, Keeper of the Accord, and Myriad Landscape. This is a bit lighter than I'd normally like to run, but we really just have to hit 5 mana by turn 5 so that we can put a sword on Kellan, and we're away to the races. In my testing, it was also pretty hard to ramp out in turns 2 and 3, as that's when you're casting Kellan and his abilities, so it's not really the most suitable deck for it. Moving on to draw, we have Rogue's Gloves, Mask of Memory, Sword of Forge and Frontier, Pure Steel Paladin, Shram, Akiri, Wylith, and Mangara the Diplomat. I'd normally like to run a bit more draw, but Mask of Memory, Wylith, and Mangara can draw us quite a bit over time, so I'm not too concerned. It really is the weak point of any Boros equipment deck, and having a low hand and eating a board wipe is basically the worst case scenario. Thankfully, Kellan can always tutor up another solution for us, so hopefully we don't get too stuck. Moving on to removal, for targeted removal we have Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, Chaos Warp, Generous Gift, and the new Stroke of Midnight. I really love Stroke of Midnight, it's basically another Generous Gift, and it's going to see a lot of play in my decks going forward. For board wipes we have Cleansing Nova, Austere Command, Blasphemous Act, and the new Expel the Interlopers, which I think is really neat since it gives you a board wipe with more control than normal at 5 mana. Lastly, for our land base, we have Access Tunnel, Alpine Meadow, Buried Ruin, Command Tower, Myriad Landscape, Needle Spires, Rogue's Passage, Sacred Peaks, and Temple of Triumph. Access Tunnel and Rogue's Passage are great game enders for a Voltron deck. Sacred Peaks and Alpine Meadow are plains for our plains ramping, and the rest are pretty standard utility lands for any commander deck. Along with these, we have 10 mountains and 16 plains, since the deck is weighted way more towards white mana than red, but most of the deck is colourless, so it's not too rough on our mana base. And that wraps up the cards for this deck, and if you're looking for a really good Equipment Matters commander, I don't think you can do much better than Kellan at this point. That is especially if your aim is to do a deck built like this around the Swords of X and Y, with a large enough budget where you could actually do all 10 swords with him, and just try to jam on as many as possible at the same time. If the Commander Replay channel doesn't cover this commander at some point, I'll be really surprised, as I bet this deck is going to be pretty similar to what they come up with all the time over there. There isn't really much more to say about it though, it's a very straightforward deck to play. Tutor equipment, play commander, put equipment on commander. Your starter's going to be very consistent, and you're going to be able to snowball fairly quickly if you can keep him on the board for a while. In my testing, the deck did struggle when up against something doing pretty hard control, but if the removal didn't happen immediately, Kellan was quickly up to 6 or 7 power and hitting for 14 a turn, plus whatever other bonuses you can put on him. There are obviously a bunch of equipment synergy cards that I couldn't fit into this deck, more than I have time to talk about really, so I'm just going to cover the ones I really wished I could have run. A Sword of Feast and Famine, or the Reaver Cleaver, along with an Aggravated Assault for an infinite attack combo. Chroma's Will for a finisher, and of course Sagada's Aid for all the equipment bonuses it can give. In terms of the other swords, Fire and Ice is a really good upgrade for Rogue's Gloves, as it draws you another card. And if you can spare a few extra dollars, I'd replace War and Peace with Sinew and Steel, because I prefer removal over damage. Of course, if you're going to build this deck without a budget, I'd really just run all 10 swords, that's kind of the point. And it's way more fun. But I think I'll leave it there and wrap up the video. This channel is getting very close to 1,000 subscribers, which is pretty neat. So that'll probably tick over sometime soonish, I guess. Hopefully I'll do something for that. If you have a suggestion, I don't know, leave a comment. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.